Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome everyone to The Explainer. Today, we're going to impartially unpack the core principles of what is undeniably one of the most famous and, let's be honest, widely debated financial texts out there, the Rich Dad philosophy. We're sticking strictly to the source material today to map out exactly what this framework teaches about wealth, work, and the mental shifts required to actually achieve financial independence. Now, our goal here isn't to endorse every controversial claim. Instead, we want to clearly lay out the author's logic so you can really understand the paradigm shift he's presented. And it all starts with a pretty provocative question. Have you ever wondered what the rich understand about the money game that the rest of us are simply missing? According to our source material, it's incredibly common for highly educated, incredibly hardworking people to struggle financially their entire lives. You know the story. They followed the traditional path, they get the degrees, they land the good jobs, and yet they constantly feel like they're barely keeping their heads above water. So why is that? What is that invisible gap in their knowledge?
Well, to answer that, we're going to break this explainer down into 6 logical steps. We'll start with the overarching rich dad philosophy, then move into redefining assets versus liabilities, minding your own business, inventing money and knowledge, overcoming financial obstacles, and finally, taking action today.
So let's jump right into step 1, the rich dad philosophy, rewriting the societal script. This entire framework rests on a central, honestly fascinating dichotomy between two father figures in the author's life. On one side, you've got his biological father, dubbed the poor dad. Now, he was highly educated, held a PhD, and worked a secure job as a teacher. On the other side, you've got the rich dad, who was actually the father of his childhood friend. This man only had an 8th grade education, but he owned multiple businesses and a ton of real estate. The source contrasts these two mindsets super vividly. The poor dad philosophy relies on the traditional societal script, right? Get a secure job, specialize in a specific field, and work for money. The rich dad philosophy completely inverts this. It argues that learning is key, not job security. It argues you shouldn't specialize, and most importantly, it preaches that you should never work for money. Your money should work for you. In fact, relying on a single specialized skill is framed by the text as extremely risky, mostly because it traps you into being entirely dependent on one employer and one single paycheck. That brings us nicely to our second section, assets versus liabilities, redefining the familiar. Okay, this section introduces what the text considers the absolute bedrock of financial literacy. And the source distills this down to incredibly simple, practical terms. An asset is simply something that puts money into your pocket. So this includes things like intellectual property, royalties from a song you wrote, or income-producing rental real estate. A liability, on the other hand, is anything that takes money out of your pocket. Now, this is where the source takes a notoriously controversial stance. It argues that the house you live in is a liability, not an asset. Why? Because you're paying for the mortgage, the taxes, the upkeep. Money is literally leaving your bank account, not entering it. The same goes for your car or your smartphone. The text urges you to ask yourself one very simple question. Is this thing pulling cash from me, or is it generating cash for me? Now, what's really interesting about this is how the text categorizes the distinct cash flow habits of different demographics based on that exact definition. According to the source, the poor see their income go straight out to basic living expenses. The middle class earns income, pays expenses, but then funnels the bulk of their remaining money into liabilities, the big personal houses, the fancy cars, the boats, and they often mistake them for assets. The rich, however, do something fundamentally different. They pay their expenses, and then they buy actual assets. Those assets then generate more income, creating this massive compounding cycle of wealth. And this beautifully sets up the author's paradigm-shifting definition of wealth. Wealth is not a raw number in a checking account. Wealth is defined as the number of days a person could survive if they stopped working today. It brilliantly pivots the goal from just hoarding total dollars to acquiring time. And the only way to increase that survival time without working is through the passive income generated by those assets we just talked about. Moving right along to Section 3, minding your own business, the McDonald's secret. The core idea here is that most people spend their entire lives working on someone else's income statement rather than building their own asset column. To illustrate this, the source shares a fantastic mini case study about Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's. Kroc would famously ask people what business they thought he was in. Naturally, everyone said, "You're in the hamburger business." But Kroc would correct them and say, "I'm not in the hamburger business. I'm in the real estate business." McDonald's uses the hamburgers to pay the operating bills, sure, but the true massive wealth of the corporation is built through quietly acquiring and owning the underlying appreciating land at all of those franchise locations. They mind their own business, their asset column,
through real estate. A significant part of minding your own business, according to the text, involves understanding business entities and the tax code. The source points out that historically, income tax wasn't permanent in America until the 16th Amendment back in 1913. Since then, the author argues, the middle class loses massive buying power because of how taxes are structured. The difference is pretty stark. Corporations are allowed to deduct their expenses first and then pay taxes on what's left over. Individual employees, however, pay taxes first, right out of their paycheck, and then they have to try and cover their living expenses with whatever remains. The text presents this not as a political statement at all, but simply as a structural reality that the wealthy leverage legally through business entities.
Let's move to a real-world example and see how this builds into practical applications, like the Section 1031 like-kind exchange in real estate. The source uses this to show how the tax code can be an incredible tool if you're financially literate. Here's the breakdown. Let's say you sell an investment property for a $100,000 profit. Normally, you'd pay a really hefty tax on that gain. But under Section 1031, if you legally identify a similar property within 45 days and reinvest your proceeds into that new, more expensive property within 6 months, you defer paying taxes on that $100,000 profit entirely. You can theoretically keep doing this indefinitely, moving profit from one property to a larger one, completely tax-free, until you finally decide to cash out. That ingenuity leads us perfectly into Section 4, Inventing Money and Knowledge. The zero-risk profit. The central tenet here is that your mind is your greatest asset, and contrary to popular belief, investments don't actually require your own starting capital if you know what you're doing. The source recounts a very specific anecdote to prove this. The author found a house in bankruptcy worth $75,000 that was being sold for just $20,000. He didn't have the money, so he borrowed a $2,000 down payment from a friend, promising to pay back $2,200. He put the house under contract, but before the closing even finished, he ran ads and sold his position to another buyer for $60,000. He paid back his friend and walked away with a massive profit without ever actually risking a single dollar of his own money. He applied a creative financial solution to literally invent money using his mind. But to recognize those opportunities in the first place, you need knowledge. The philosophy heavily emphasizes working for knowledge, not for money. For example, the author took a job at Xerox. Why? Definitely not because of the paycheck. He took it because he knew his biggest weakness was social skills and a fear of rejection. And Xerox happened to have the best sales training program available. He used the job as a paid educational system to turn a personal weakness into a highly profitable strength. Now, even with all this financial literacy, we still face roadblocks. This brings us to Section 5, Overcoming Financial Obstacles, Breaking Mental Barriers. The text argues that just knowing what to do isn't enough. It's internal mental roadblocks that ultimately prevent people from building their asset columns. The source identifies 5 specific roadblocks. First is the fear of losing money, which basically paralyzes people into playing it so safe they miss obvious opportunities. Second is cynicism, listening to naysayers who analyze constantly but never actually act. Third is a really fascinating one, laziness disguised as busyness. People stay busy with things that don't really matter just to avoid doing the hard financial work. The text suggests a simple cure for this mental laziness. Instead of saying, I can't afford it, which literally shuts down the brain, ask, how can I afford it? This forces your mind to actively search for solutions. The final 2 roadblocks are bad habits that quietly drain wealth and arrogance, which the author argues is often just a mask people use to hide their own ignorance from themselves. So how do we push past those roadblocks? That brings us to our final section, taking action today, starting the journey. This is the practical application of all these overarching philosophies. The source provides a rapid-fire list of actionable takeaways for viewers wanting to build their asset column right now. You need to assess what is and isn't working in your current budget. You must actively seek out new knowledge and mentors. Seriously, don't be afraid to ask successful people for guidance. You should pay your professionals, your accountants, your lawyers, your brokers exceptionally well because good advice makes you money. Most importantly, delay gratification. Do not buy a luxury item until an asset you own generates the cash to pay for it. Get out there, study geographical markets, and start making offers on investments. The overriding theme here is that action always beats inaction. Even if you fail, you learn. If you do nothing, you stay exactly where you are. And that brilliantly illustrates the core decision you have to make moving forward. We've defined exactly what the source material considers an asset and what it considers a liability. The choice of which path to take is entirely up to you. So I'll leave you with this lingering thought to chew on today. When that next paycheck finally hits your bank account, What exactly are you going to buy with it? An asset or a liability? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll